They say the wind out here carries more than dust. It carries memory, regret, and sometimes the whispered promise of something unfinished. I didn't believe it either, not until the day Sadie Blanchard vanished from town, leaving behind a single red ribbon tied around the cottonwood tree where she once said yes to a man who'd never said, "I love you," but had made her a vow that changed everything. If you believe second chances sometimes wear dusty boots and speak with more truth than tenderness, make sure to like and subscribe, because this story isn't just about love. It's about the courage it takes to accept it when it's offered with calloused hands and no guarantees. Sadie Blanchard had been a widow longer than she'd ever been a wife. 2 years, 1 month, and 14 days, to be exact, when Levi Crowther showed up on the edge of her property with a saddlebag full of quiet intentions and a sentence that nearly made her drop the iron kettle she was scrubbing clean. The wind had been howling that morning, the kind that whips around corners and slaps laundry off the line, and Sadie, hair pinned up and sleeves rolled high, had been cursing softly at the rust stain that wouldn't lift from her late husband's best pot. She hadn't seen Levi ride up, hadn't heard his horse's hooves crunch the dry leaves, or else maybe she would have straightened her spine or smoothed her skirt. But when she looked up, he was just there, all 6'4" of him, a long shadow cast over her porch. "I ain't here to stir trouble," he'd said, voice low and even, eyes steady in the way of men who only speak when they mean to be heard. "I just came to make a proposition." Sadie didn't answer right away. She wasn't in the habit of entertaining cowboys who strolled up without warning. Least of all him, a man with a reputation for silence and strength in equal measure. Folks in Gracemont called him the Crow, part because of his name, but more because he watched everything and said nothing. War veteran, rancher, stranger. "Well?" she asked finally, wiping her hands on her apron and meeting his gaze like she did with her most stubborn students. "Let's have it then." What came next wasn't flirtation or flattery, but something else, something that cracked open the thin ice Sadie had been skating on just to survive. "I need a wife," Levi said plainly, "and you need someone who don't flinch at hard winters or hard truths. I ain't offering love. I'm offering protection, provision, and a child before the leaves fall." Sadie blinked, certain she'd misheard. But Levi didn't fumble, didn't explain or soften the words. He just stood there, solid as an oak, waiting. Her first thought was, how dare he? Her second was, how did he know? Because Levi Crowther had never looked at her twice before, and yet somehow, this man knew she woke at night aching for something more than silence, for a future that wouldn't wither under the weight of loneliness. But she wasn't a fool. "You want a child?" she asked slowly. "With me?" He nodded once. "I want a son with your eyes and your stubborn heart. A family, not just a name on a deed or a ring on a finger. I got land. I got stock. What I don't got is time to waste on pretending. If you say yes, I'll build you a room of your own, put your name on every ledger, and ride into town beside you every Sunday like a proper husband. But this starts now, because by autumn, I want you carrying our child and knowing you're safe." Sadie had never been speechless before, not at the funeral, not when the bank threatened foreclosure, not even when she buried her wedding dress in a box under the floorboards. But Levi's words struck something deep, something she buried so well she forgot it had a name: hope. Still, she wasn't some lovesick girl. She crossed her arms, eyes narrowed. "You come here talking babies before you've even asked me how I take my coffee?" He gave the faintest smile, the kind a man shows when he knows he's walking a tightrope but isn't scared of the fall. "I figure we'll figure that part out," he said. "And if you say no, I'll ride off and not breathe a word of this to soul." But Sadie didn't say no. Not right away. She told him she'd think about it, then watched as he rode off into the rising wind, dust curling behind his boots like smoke from a match that hadn't yet been lit. That night, she didn't sleep. She opened the cedar box beneath her floorboards and stared at the folded baby bonnet her mother had knit 5 winters ago, just before her womb went quiet and her future felt sealed. And when the sun rose, she stood beneath that cottonwood tree, where the ground still held her husband's buried name, and waited for Levi to return. Because whether or not she admitted it aloud, his words had rooted themselves deep in her, like seeds that could still grow if given rain and time. And in her gut, Sadie Blanchard knew one thing for certain. By autumn, everything would change. Sadie Blanchard moved into Levi Crowther's ranch house on the first morning of August, And though the contract she signed with him was written in plain ink and practical terms, the moment she crossed the threshold, she felt like she was stepping into something holy and irreversible, like a church where the preacher forgot to light the candles, but God showed up anyway. And nothing about that house was what she expected. It wasn't cold or Spartan or masculine in the way town gossip claimed Levi was, but warm in the corners and strangely thoughtful, with clean windows that let in the breeze and a kitchen that smelled faintly of cedar and cloves, like someone had been trying, quietly, and without knowing why, to make space for someone else for a long time. Levi had kept his word. She had her own room, her own space, her own key, and a pantry full of staples she hadn't had to ask for. He even remembered the cinnamon she once mentioned using in her coffee, though she hadn't realized he'd heard her. They were polite at first, like strangers seated side by side on a long train ride, each staring out their own window at the same landscape, not yet brave enough to ask what the other saw. During the day, she taught lessons to local ranch hands' children in the barn Levi converted into a makeshift schoolroom, while he worked the perimeter of the property, his broad figure moving steadily across the dry hills, mending fence lines and checking water troughs. At night, they ate dinner at the long oak table his father built, never with candles, never with music, just quiet forks on porcelain and the occasional conversation about weather or livestock or which of the neighbors' bulls was getting too frisky near their heifers. But something started shifting in the spaces between words, in the way he waited to eat until she'd sat down, or how he filled her with Ben without being asked, or the way she caught him watching her when she laughed too loud at one of her own stories. They hadn't touched since the handshake at the cottonwood tree, but when their hands brushed by accident one morning as they reached for the same bucket, she didn't flinch, and neither did he. And in that tiny pause, where most people would have apologized, Levi looked at her like he was memorizing something he hadn't known he needed to remember. That night, when Sadie lit the lanterns on the porch, she noticed the row of tulip bulbs he'd left near the steps, wrapped gently in burlap, with a note that read for planting before first frost. She hadn't told him tulips were her favorite, but she had once paused too long at the florist's cart in town, and apparently, Levi Crowther remembered things other men forgot. That Sunday, when they rode into Gracemont together in the wagon, side by side for the first time since their contract was signed, the townsfolk stared like they were watching a ghost learn to walk. She heard Mrs. Langford mutter he didn't even hold her hand, and Reverend Tyne narrowed his eyes like he couldn't decide whether to bless or scold them. But Levi walked her to her seat in the front pew and stood so close during the hymns that his shoulder brushed hers with every breath. After the service, Marcus Gideon, the banker's boy-turned-deputy, approached Levi with a smile that didn't touch his eyes and said too casually, "Didn't think you were the marrying kind, Crowther." To which Levi replied, low and even, "Didn't think it was your business, Gideon." And Sadie watched Marcus blink once, laugh nervously, and back away like a coyote who realized the bear wasn't sleeping after all. That night, as they sat on the porch drinking coffee, Sadie asked Levi why he looked so tense after church, and he told her that Marcus wasn't just sniffing around town gossip. He was sniffing around Levi's land, asking the registrar about old deeds and border disputes. "He's got a rich uncle with cattle dreams and a mean streak," Levi muttered, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. "And I reckon he thinks a widow and a soldier make easy prey." Sadie didn't say anything right away. She just reached over, took his coffee cup from his hand, and drank from it without asking. Her way of saying we're in this together now, even if the papers they signed never used the word love. That night, she didn't sleep in her own room. She didn't ask permission, and he didn't say a word when she pushed open his door, crossed the floor barefoot, and slipped beneath the quilt beside him. He didn't touch her, not at first, just turned slightly, so she could feel the heat of his body radiating like a stove banked for winter. But before dawn, when the coyotes howled and the wind beat hard against the shutters, he pulled her into his arms with a tenderness so careful it broke her heart more than anything violent ever could. And in the silence of that prairie dawn, she whispered something she hadn't said in years, not since her husband's final breath left her alone in a world too big for one heart. She said, "I'm not afraid anymore." And Levi, holding her like she was made of both glass and fire, said, "Good, because come autumn, Sadie, we ain't gonna be alone anymore." The first cold snap came early that year, slicing through the Wyoming plains like a blade honed by bitter memory, and Sadie Blanchard Crowther stood in the middle of her half-finished kitchen garden, one hand resting low on her belly, the other shielding her eyes as she watched Levi ride in from the west pasture with a kind of awe she still hadn't learned how to name. He looked tired, dusty, wind-whipped, jaw clenched like it always got when he was thinking too hard. But when he saw her standing there, waiting like she always did now, something eased in his shoulders, something softened in that steel-lined soul of his. It had been only 8 weeks since the morning she first told him, voice trembling and eyes brimming. "You kept your promise, Levi. I'm with child." He hadn't spoken right away, just gone to his knees in the dirt and rested his ear gently against her stomach, like he expected to hear the future whispering from inside her. And in the days since, their world had grown quieter, deeper, steadier. The townsfolk still talked, but not with suspicion anymore. Now they called her Mrs. Crowther like it meant something. The children at school painted crayon drawings of her holding a baby. The preacher started nodding respectfully when he passed them on the street. And the men who once thought Levi too strange, too silent, too much a man apart, they'd started asking his opinion on fence posts and water tables like maybe they'd always respected him and were just too proud to say so. But it wasn't until the fire came that Sadie truly understood what kind of man she had married. A late-night spark in the barn, wind-fed and roofless, took half the hay stores and 2 of the outbuildings before Levi, and half the town beat it back. Sadie had run barefoot into the yard, screaming for him, smoke stinging her eyes and lungs, and when she saw him stumble out of the flames carrying a burned foal in his arms, bare-chested, bleeding, eyes wild, something ancient cracked open inside her. That night, after the doctor stitched his back and she washed the soot from his hands, she whispered, "You don't ever get to leave me, Levi Crowther. Do you understand?" And he, exhausted and aching but more alive than she'd ever seen him, answered, "Not even death'll take me from you now." By the first frost, the tulips she planted had begun to push tender green tips above the soil, defiant against the freeze. Levi found her watching them one morning, her shawl pulled tight, cheeks flushed from the cold. "I didn't think they'd survive," she said quietly. He looked at her, not the flowers, her, and said, "Some things are meant to take root, no matter how hard the ground." Then he dropped to one knee in the dirt, not with a ring, but with a folded piece of paper in his hand. "It ain't fancy," he said, "but it's legal. Says if anything ever happens to me, this land, this house, the stock, and everything under the sun, it's yours. Yours and the baby's. I already gave you my word. This just makes it law." And she, Sadie Blanchard, the widow turned wife, the woman who once believed her life was something to endure, not bloom inside of, took that paper in both hands and wept. Not for the loss, for the having, for the home, for the man, for the name her child would carry. And as the sun rose across the frost-slick hills, painting the land in amber light, Sadie whispered the name she'd chosen if it was a boy. And Levi, wrapping his arms around her from behind, said, "Then I reckon it's time to start building the nursery." By autumn, she had more than a child growing inside her. She had a life, a love, a name that could never be taken.